Hello and welcome to The Found Cause, where we found the cause and serve the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm Michael Mann behind the machine, and to my right, but to your left is...
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
Hey, Sebastian. I'll have you know, Sebastian is, for a while, before we were on camera, just speaking in mics in this podcast, was the man with the wine, always bringing wine over. I don't usually have any alcohol, but Sebastian is a connoisseur, a real sommelier. Is that how you say it in French?
Yeah.
In any case, he's... been feeding me wine, and for whatever reason today I'm really feeling it. So if I say anything dumb, I'm just gonna blame Sebastian vicariously. This kind of fits actually for our intro, because we're gonna be talking about the flood. And if you know anything about the flood, if you're a Christian, you'll know that post-flood Noah plants himself a vineyard and gets I always thought it was unknowingly drunk, like he didn't know that wine makes you drunk, or like wasn't familiar with it, or maybe like fermentation was a new thing on the new earth afterwards. So he gets drunk, and then Ham, mocks him and looks at him, and then calls his brothers in. But the two brothers come and like shield their eyes and then clothe them, and Ham is cursed for that. Noah ends up cursing him. So in the same way, if you audience make fun of me, you'll be cursed forever, and so will your descendants. So sorry.
So that was the plan all along. I see.
Yes, it was all for the plan. I had like this much wine. For the record, actually, I'm sounding probably like I had a ton. I barely any. I never eat it, drink it. All right. All that being said, please cut us some slack. But today is about creationism. Now, we've done an episode on creationism before, but that was more along the lines of does the Bible and the current evolutionary frameworks, do they match up? Can we meet them together? And the conclusion was you can't. That the Bible clearly talks about creation in the way that traditionally people know Christians believe about creation, that God made the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh. Yes, those are literal days, like normal days. And that, two, he created all the animals and plants and everything according to their kinds in those 6 days. They didn't evolve from each other. They were all made as distinct kinds and lived together on earth. And that man was made alongside these things in the sixth day. And of course, it's made after God's image to take care of all the plants, and that the earth has been happening for, by our calculations via the biblical timelines, about 6,000 years. So that is the biblical record, and of course there's many distortions of that and many Christians who want to flee from that, and we all discussed that in that previous creationism episode. This one's going to be a little different. This one is on the actual evidence. So something we had pushed out on that creationism episode was all the specific evidences for creationism and the flood narrative in particular, which is such a big portion of the creation narrative. They're always talking about, well, there's evidence for this giant flood, and you Christians are crazy, and by they I mean secularists. So let's set up exactly what me and Sebastian are talking about when we say the flood, why it's important, and what we plan to glean from this. So I'll say right at the start, if you're familiar with Christianity, you probably know about the flood, but we're going to go out a little bit more in detail, prove and assert again that it really did happen, that it was literal, at least if you're a Bible believer, that you can't ignore the fact that the flood really would have happened because it's referenced throughout the Bible. Mm-hmm. And the important thing that we're looking to get out of this discussion today is that Christians do not have to run from science. And I understand that often believing Christians, ones that hold to the Bible, will hold to the Bible against what scientists say. And I think that often they're right in doing that, but maybe for the wrong reasons. And I would like to discuss the actual evidences from science, from real science, real knowledge that we see out in the world, so that you know that it lines up with what the biblical narrative is. We don't have to be afraid of the world, of what we might find in the fossil record, or what we might find in physics or out in space. We don't have to be afraid of actual things that happen in the world, because if we trust that the Bible is true, it should be congruent with what's actually happening out there. And so this is my assertion that actually the secularists, those who don't believe in God and have many different narratives, are the wrong ones, and we should be confident and approach this subject confidently that the Bible is truth and that God is real. Those are things we should be confident in and not be scared of scientists who might say otherwise. So that's kind of the general theme of why we're even doing this. But first things first, Sebastian, can you... actually, I'll pin that because I actually have the Genesis stuff pulled up. We're going to talk about the flood and exactly what it is, how it happened, and then Sebastian's got a bunch of verses that demonstrate that it really is believed to have happened from the biblical authors themselves. And so we would assert that if you're a believing Christian and believe that this flood is... I'm gonna start, even if you're a believing Christian and believe this is a local flood, a Mesopotamian flood. I know there's some like Michael Dr. Dr. Michael Heiser, he believes it's a local flood, or at least it's arguably a local flood. I don't think that the biblical precedent talks about it like that. And so, or even if you think it's like totally spiritual, that there wasn't even a local flood, well, then again, I would disagree with you. Let me read exactly what the flood is, and we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm.
So from the Bible, Genesis 1, so right off the gate, God is producing every creature according to its kind. And that'll come up later, but I just wanted to say that God says here in Genesis 1, and God said, let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above on the earth above the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing in which the water teems and moves about in it, and according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the sea, and let the birds increase in the earth. There was evening, there was morning, the fifth day. And then he goes on to create all the creatures in the ground, and again, it uses that word kind. So you'll see that right out of the gate, God's creation narrative has him creating creatures according to their kinds, which is kind of a weird word. We don't use that classification today, but that'll come up later when we're talking about fossil evidence. But let me skip that for now. It's just Genesis 1, so I'm doing things in order. Genesis 7 has the flood narrative, and I have it pulled up. So here's Genesis 7, and of course, you know the story. Adam and Eve fall to sin, and then God kicks them out of the garden, and eventually sets up this scenario where the earth has become so wicked, and particularly man on earth have become so wicked, that God is going to kill them all. He is grieved that he ever even made them, but he is going to save the world through Noah, because he's the only righteous man that he's found on earth, and so he floods the world. He sends a flood that floods the entire earth, all of it, again, that I would assert, and I think the text asserts that this is not a local flood. It floods the whole earth. Some, again, say that that's hyperbole, and it was really just meaning the local area, and it was so big and devastating and important that it was the whole earth. But what would be weird if it was just a local flood is that God sends a pair of all the unclean animals, 7 pairs of every clean animal, and 7 pair of every bird to come and rest on the ark with Noah. And he's supposed to give them food for a long period of time, over 150 days, because the flood lasts for like 180 or 85, so people estimate, based on the text. And again, that sounds hardly local. Why would God have to send all these animals to the ark if it was just a local flood? So anyways, I think the text clearly asserts that it's global, kills all men that aren't on the ark, all creatures that crawled on the ground, and all creatures that flew in the sky. Not all the creatures in the ocean, but those 3 categories otherwise. And that's why they had to be preserved in the ark. And notice also, I think a little known fact, and this is just for fun for you Christian nerds out there, that it's not just a pair. It's not just 2 by 2 like you might learn in your nursery rhyme or in your Sunday school. Interestingly enough, I don't know how significant it is, but 2 of every unclean animal are brought in the ark, yes, but 7 pairs, so 14 in total, of every clean animal are brought in the ark, and then 7 pairs, so 14 in total, of every bird kind are brought in the ark, which is interesting because birds are one of the most diverse I don't even know what they're called, order of animals, class of animals that we see out there, and clean animals are the ones we think of as livestock, typically. That's typically what clean animals are, the ones we eat, the ones we keep, and they are abundant now because we raise them, but I think they would have been also abundant post-flood because the most of them were brought on the ark. And as for the unclean animals, that's everything else, lizards and everything like that. We know, I'm giving the preview here, but we know that many creatures went extinct in the past that aren't here today. And I would posit that not only did the flood, this global flood, kill the vast majority of all those animals, it killed the clean animals too, but when they came back, so off the ark, those unclean animals had a very hard time surviving for a multitude of reasons. 1, because there was only 1 pair of them. 2, because there wasn't much food after the flood. And then 3, because the genetic diversity of those animals would have been far lower than the birds and the clean animals. And so they would have had more genetic defects and just generally had a worse time afterwards. So that would still allow for mass extinction post the flood, even though they were brought in the ark and preserved that way, if that makes any sense. So somebody might say, oh, why was there an extinction event at all if these animals were preserved in the flood? And I would say that it was because only a pair of the unclean animals were brought on the ark, whereas 7 pair of the birds and the clean animals were brought. So let me read the actual text. So I gave all that context. Here's the actual text of the flood itself, just to prove that it's not the candy, happy-go-lucky giraffe sticking out of the tiny little ark version of the flood. This is from the actual Bible. For 40 days, The flood kept coming on the earth, and the waters increased as they lifted the ark high above the earth. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth, and the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Again, is that local? No, even the mountains were covered.
Mm-hmm.
The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. That's roughly 20 feet above the mountains. Every living thing that moved in the land perished: bird, livestock, wild animals, and all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing in the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days. Then they began to decrease. So, and what I'm not going to read here because it goes into Genesis 8, but is that 150-day mark is only for when the waters decreased enough for the ark to rest on the mountain of Ararat. He actually stayed in the ark, Noah and his family, for another 3 months, roughly, because food had not become abundant on the earth yet, right? They just settled on the mountain. Most of the earth was covered in seawater. That's not very conducive to food. That's why he ends up sending out the raven. We all know the story. He sends out the raven and the dove to find if there's enough food, if there's enough fauna for animals to feed. It's not just Noah, it's all the rest of the animals in the ark. So again, 40 days and 40 nights, yes, is how much it rained, and we all know that from the Sunday school nursery rhyme stuff, but it was actually a longer period than you might be thinking, and so there was plenty of time, all that to say, for things to have been happening while Noah and his family were on the ark. That is, changes to be happening to the earth, animals still surviving and fleeing the floodwaters,
Mm-hmm.
people surviving and fleeing the floodwaters, things like that. No, they all eventually died, but it wasn't just an instant blam, everything's dead, and 40 days later, they're all back to normal. It was a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to be exciting just going over all these examples later today in the podcast. So, and something I do want to mention too is that, and tell me if you want to hold off on this, but this isn't just Moses was inspired at some point and noted all of this down, or or his scribe, whoever you want to say it, wrote the first 5 books. People throughout the Bible have believed in this narrative, and I can cite some examples.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Going on that. So, most people are going to think of Job. So, that one here in Job 22 cites the flood. You just say, what does God know? So, actually, before I say, they're arguing back and forth with friends and Job. Why is this happening to him? This is part of the argument when they're discussing with each other. You just say, what does God know? Does he judge through such darkness? Thick clouds veil him, so he does not see us as he goes about in the vaulted heavens? Will you keep to the old path that the wicked have trod? They were carried off before the time, their foundations washed away by the flood. So again, a reference to the flood washing away everything. So that would be from Job.
And notable there, I think the reason you're saying it's often quoted to show that the Old Testament proves that the flood was talked about, because Job is believed to be pre-Moses. So it would have been before organized Israel, even before, Abraham, perhaps. He might have been contemporary with Abraham, might have been contemporary in the Judges' time, but in any case, he was organized Jewish culture. So it's a flood narrative from before.
Yeah, so separate from the other narrative. So
yes.
It's along with that. So, and before we save it for the best one, which is the man himself, I'm going to mention Peter. In the New Testament, the flood is also mentioned. So this isn't just some Old Testament Jewish thingy that they come up with and then they just held back then. People mention the New Testament also held to this belief. Peter, nonetheless, who was an apostle of Jesus. So, from 2 Peter chapter 3. But they deliberately forget that long ago by God's word the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. But the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for fire, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. So, important notice a couple of things. Saying that by God's word, the world came into being, so it's not just an accident. Yes, exactly. He spoke, and it came into being. And by water, again, the same from God, the Spirit was floating in the waters. And just by water, how it was created, it was destroyed, the deluge. And had a nice discussion on the word, like cataclysmos in Greek, to be submerged. Cataclysm, that's where the word comes from. So it's like indwelled, submerged by water, destroyed by water. So reinforcing the narrative. And also there's this symbol of judgment, just like implying how water was used then. Okay, now for the future judgment, restored for fire. So also on that same note, it's the judgment narrative for the people of the time, likewise for the people in the future. And I saved the best for last, for Jesus himself, from Matthew 24, a book we have been reading and memorizing, so we must have encountered this. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also be the coming of the Son of Man. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So I think
straight from Jesus.
That reinforces again that if you have a problem with the Old Testament, we have a whole discussions on that in some of our scripture podcasts, and maybe we'll do some in the future. But needless to say, even if you do have a problem with the Old Testament, you don't trust it as reliable history, whatever, know that Jesus, who, if you're calling yourself any semblance of a real Christian, you believe in Jesus, he's referencing it just as it's referenced in the Old Testament. He's not saying it's some fake story. He's referencing it like it actually happened. And in fact, he knows better than all of us because he's God and was there, right? Whereas Peter wasn't even there. He's just going off of the tradition, but right. Jesus was.
And he is mirroring this to his second coming. So if you're a Christian, believe that he's going to come back. Okay, that's good. As you can see here, he is using what happened before towards... If this was metaphorical, then his second coming is metaphorical, and then what are we doing? If it's just a metaphor, why? If he's going to come back, it's just, if he's like Buddha, like why are we gonna? What's the point?
Yeah.
But no, we hold, and he said that he's coming back. Okay, likewise, comparing to the judgment of the destruction that happened back then, likewise, it's gonna be his second coming. And if you're what's the phrase? Like
red letter Christian, red letter Bible kind of guy.
This is all red letters.
Yep.
So I would just say you have to reevaluate your thinking. If you say you're Christian, but then you find you wanna just throw out the Old Testament, like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah,
and I think so. Understand this. Summary is: if you're a Christian, you should believe in a worldwide flood. I think, and again, there's some that argue for a local flood. In any case, it's a real flood that happened. I can't see how you make this a local flood. I have to say, but in any case, this is a vision for the world that corresponds with reality. We all know that there has been mass extinctions because we've been through science class, wherever there's large amounts of species and kinds, not just species. Like there's plenty of species on Earth that aren't so different from one another, right? They're very similar. I would call them the same kind. We have many classes in our biological categorizations today that we've created. Species is the smallest, but then it goes up into genus. I'm forgetting all my stuff. It's the cheesecake and the wine. My gosh. Genus is the next level up past species. And I would say maybe that correlates to kind. Above genus is family, I believe, and maybe family is more of the kind. Whatever. The biblical word is inexact, but it does give you an idea that it's more than just individual, and it's more than just species, probably. I'm imagining it is some sort of genus or family that it's talking about. And there are many families and orders and classes, actually, that have been completely wiped off the face of the earth that we'd never see again. So we're aware of that as Christians, and we say, well, look, that corresponds to the flood, and that not only were a majority of everything destroyed, living creatures destroyed at that time, but those that survived through the ark would have quickly died afterwards, meaning there would be little evidence that they ever lived at all after the period of the flood. But let's quickly touch on then the counter narrative. So why are we even going over this? Why is it even contentious for Christians to believe that the flood is real and worldwide and actually happened? Well, that's because, and again, I'm sure you're aware, there's a huge counter narrative going on, not only in this country, in the United States, but also throughout the rest of the world. Wherever evolution is preached, there's a evolution-linked narrative that talks about a completely different narrative for why we have these fossils that have all died and what happened to them and the time span for things. Sebastian, do you want to give the general, like, how long do they think the Earth has been going on? What's their explanation for finding dead things in the ground?
For billions of years, well, the number has been fluctuating a little bit.
4.8 is the one that I remember.
Yes.
It goes up, goes down. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can give or take 4.8. So, and the origin. Let's start at the very beginning. Say that the argument that I've most commonly heard is that life originated by high concentration of energy upon a concentration of chemicals, possibly lightning hitting that area, so high amounts of energy, that's what they're implying. And then those chemicals were energized at just the right amount with the appropriate combination of materials nearby, amino acids, to form these things, amino acids, and all the components of lipids, all components of cells, and that created life. And then from there, life started to develop from one cell, you could say, and then start reproducing, and then from there you start getting more complex life forms. So from bacteria, unicellular unicellular beings, to multicellular, and then to algae that have chloroplasts, chlorophyll, and then from there more complex plants, and then eventually to land creatures, obviously smaller and then getting larger and larger over time, and then eventually down the line humans, from reptiles and that were on land, and then mammals, and then obviously from mammals, monkeys, from apes, we will be as humans. So that is the narrative. Obviously, for billions and millions of years, this has taken place. That will be the theory of evolution. So, in essence, the theory of evolution would state that that the species adapt to the environment, and then this creates divergence in we have different creatures walking around the earth. Is because of different conditions that they were in. They were diverging over time to create. It's like a tree. Pretty much that's the drawing. They diverge into these different ecosystems and whatnot. So that is the main narrative. That took a really long time for animals and life to form.
Mm-hmm. And then throughout that time, again, if you've ever walked through this with evolutionists and seen it on Science Channel or wherever you're learning your stuff, they also believe that there's large changes in the Earth that have occurred over this course of Earth history. So there's been different ages, they would call them. There's the age, the Precambrian era, which is all these like little tiny, either microscopic things or like super tiny animals, like, barely visible to the human eye, tiny little shellfish, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But past the Precambrian era is the Cambrian explosion, they call it, and that's when like lots of shellfish, lots of marine animals popped out suddenly because that was the new fad. I think it was because their theory is that algae oxygenated the world because algae produces oxygen as a result of photosynthesis, and there wasn't a lot of oxygen pre. That's not consistent with the record of rocks. You can take samples of things like sap, for example, to show how much oxygen was in the atmosphere at those times, and even in the water and other rocks, how much oxygen was in these rocks that would have been formed at that time. And there was oxygen in the atmosphere, but ignoring that because oxygen doesn't allow for the origin of life thing that they were talking about with the lightning and stuff. Life can't form with oxygen-rich environments. Ignoring all that, algae would have created oxygen so that more advanced life forms could start respirating and living, because while life can't form with oxygen, it needs oxygen usually to live. So algae allowed for the Cambrian explosion of all these little tiny sea creatures. The sea creatures eventually started wandering onto land because plants had also evolved and transformed to be able to live on land instead of just in the ocean. And then they started eating those things, and ones that could eat were able to reproduce, and then more successful traits get passed on. And then during that time, there's a couple different cataclysmic events, if you want to say, in the evolutionary mythology. They say, we all know famously, they believe that a large meteor destroyed or caused the extinction of most dinosaurs. They believe a large meteor struck the Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, and that caused a tidal wave, sure, but also dust in the atmosphere that caused plants to die out and a mass starvation that killed all of the dinosaurs, and really all of them, because no dinosaurs exist today. There's lizards, small, and there's crocodiles and birds, because they believe that birds came from dinosaurs, but there's no dinosaurs at all today. So they believe that dinosaurs were 100% wiped out because of the starvation food shortage that this meteorite caused, which is interesting because other creatures lived, so you would have think there'd still be some dinosaurs, but no, there's zero. And we, of course, would argue that that is from the flood, and the corresponding years afterwards where there's a big food shortage, but like way bigger than some meteorite, like a huge food shortage that not only wiped out the majority of the population to begin with, but also didn't let the population of dinosaurs really take root. Plus, it was a limited gene pool. There's a lot of reasons why the dinosaurs would have died off post-flood. So that's the narrative, that it's been billions of years. I think that the time span of life has been like 2 billion years, or the 4.8 that Earth has been around in 2 billion years. But that things have been slowly progressing, and that the big fossil deposits that we find, so fossils of dinosaurs and fossils of extinct animals, are just from some of the phases of life that Earth has experienced massive extinctions. Because there was a massive extinction when the meteor came, but also a second one after it, and then several previous. There's several key mass die-offs in the evolutionary mythology. We would argue, I think, that really the only mass die-off is the flood. Perhaps there's another one somewhere along modern human history, but I would probably argue that the only die-off that there was, that we observe all throughout the Earth, massive extinctions, is probably just the flood, as opposed to multiple different ones that evolutionists would say.
As drastic and cataclysmic as a flood, yeah, probably just the flood. I mean, if you're pretty nerdy, that ice age that caused the fall of the Roman Empire and, China and the civilizations in the Americas, caused them just to explode, like the ice. Could consider that, some cataclysm, but yeah, like the flood. No, just the flood. That completely like moving everything, shaping land, destroying land, and wiping entire species. Just like that.
Yeah, and we see species go extinct today all the time, and you'll see numbers from environmental groups saying that there's a certain amount of species that are dying off each year, and that's kind of to be expected, not only because of natural climate changes that happen, like desertification or droughts or local floods even, or just little ice ages, starvation. Lots of things can eliminate species, but eliminating whole genuses, whole like classes. Imagine you could have like everybody in a town die, for human perspective here, you could have everybody in a town die, but it would be a totally different thing if everybody in Europe died. And that's kind of the difference between, a species of owl dying and all owls dying, because one is way bigger than the other. And in the flood and in these periods where we see fossils of entire orders and classes of animals dying, that's the equivalent of all of Europe dying, like a whole branch of things dying, not just a particular species, not a particular family. So all that being said, these are the two opposing narratives. Let's examine the facts and see which one proves to be consistent with the outside world. So specifically, I want to examine some fossil evidence. So using fossils, that is the dead remains of things that had died that are preserved in rock. Is there evidence for the flood? And this is probably the big saber-rattling attack that atheists and people who believe in the evolutionary timescale, so not just atheists, but those who hold to that long-term narrative, have with creationists, is they immediately point to the flood. Because first of all, everyone knows the flood story, and second of all, it so directly accounts for all the mass dying off and the fossilization that's seen around everywhere that seculars know this, and they want to immediately attack it and question if it ever existed. So this is a popular topic, and so there's a decent amount of talk to be had about it. I don't know if you want to go first, Sebastian, but I have plenty of little points to talk about on evidence for the flood having happened. Otherwise, I'll just rattle off.
Please.
All right.
I'll jump
All right.
in. I want to see how you start first.
Okay. So if you're ever interested, by the way, there are, especially these days with the advent of YouTube and everything like that, there are so many resources online from a creationist perspective that aren't crazy. I'm not guaranteeing you won't find some kind of wacky people out there that are on the creationist side, because there are. Equally, there are wacky people on the evolutionist side. So there's just wacky people in general on the internet. I don't know if you've been there yet, but there's some strange, and here's two of them. So take things with a grain of salt, even if they're claiming to be a Christian or they are a genuine Christian. They could just be mistaken. But these days, like Genesis Apologetics is a great novel channel. Genesis is History, pretty on the nose channel name there, is one we've used for this podcast. Ken Ham's group, which is Answers in Genesis, they have a lot of things. There's another one that I'm reading, the Creation Institute. So there's plenty of reputable sources that are out there actually trying to find legitimate research, not doing weird numerology in the Bible to prove things or any other wonky stuff that some groups have done in the past. These are genuine scientists that come from real fields, and they're dedicated to making their research as sound to the secular world as possible. So I would encourage you, if you're really interested in this and you're a Christian and you want to be more edified than we can give you right here, go out and see these videos. Plenty of video content. There's also articles out there. So, there's a wealth of information. But let me go over some of the highlights that we've found for the flood in particular. First of all, fossilization itself. So even finding fossils at all. Fossils, as any scientist, secularist or not, will tell you, are very hard to come by. They're a rare thing to happen. That's why we don't have many of them even in today. Fossilization requires a couple of things. First of all, the first hurdle to get over is that the body of the animal needs to not have been decomposed. As we all know, if an animal dies out in the wilderness, or even if a plant dies out in the wilderness, it will wither and die. Bugs will eat it. Vultures will, eat the flesh. Whatever little critters might come and eat the actual flesh of the creature. And if not them, flies and other bugs and stuff will come and eat the animal from the inside out. And if not flies, just bacteria will come and eat the animal out. And eventually it will be nothing but bones. And eventually those bones are actually eaten by bacteria and other creatures and crunched up in the mouths of things that bite it and all this type of stuff. So eventually the bones aren't even there, and it's gone. There's only a couple of times where the bones remain, and bones are usually pretty brittle and don't last very long. To actually become fossilized, you need to replace the bones, at least a portion of the bones, with rock. And the way you do that is kind of like osmosis, where if you're in the water, like if you're in a pool or a bathtub, you eventually get wrinkly. Well, that's because the water in you is more salty than the water you're sitting in. And so your water leaves you to go into the less salty water, and therefore you lose water in your body. Well, in the same way, it's not osmosis, but a similar kind of process, calcium in the bones is replaced by rock sediments, by limestone and other things inside the rock that fossil is the bones are sitting in. So 3 things. The animal needs to die. It needs to not have been destroyed by the many decomposers out there that could be decomposing its bones or its body or other parts of it. 2, it needs to be buried in a kind of soil that can replace its calcium for stone so that it actually lasts a long time. And notably, on land, there are scavengers and things decompose, and it's really hard to get a fossil on land, but it's even harder to do in water because water has a thick layer of mud at the bottom of it, usually, depending on your water source. But the ocean and lakes and bogs and everything usually have a big layer of mud at the bottom, and in that mud is all sorts of decomposers because it's basically like a giant cesspool of dead things in the bottom there. So it's just a smorgasbord for animals that decompose things. So if you're in water and you die, so if you're a fish and you're in water and you die, your body floats to the ground, and if nothing eats you, which would be kind of rare, but if nothing eats you on the ground, you have to get really deep, like 5 to 6 to 7 feet underneath the layer of mud on the ground bottom of the ocean or bottom of the lake or wherever you are, to avoid being eaten by all the flesh-eating microbes and little animals that are there that would destroy you. So you need to die and avoid topside decomposition from animals. You need to be in a muddy, silty soil that will replace your calcium in your bones with rock. And you need to be buried very quickly, so quickly that even the thick layers of things that would normally decompose you can't get to you. So all those things taking place, there's really only a couple events that can fossilize, and the most easy and the most common one is flooding, which ding, 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 it makes sense, right? If there's a large flood, that it would create a lot of fossils because it would deposit sediment really quickly, kill things really quickly, and so none of the decomposers could get to it, not the active ones that run around and chomp on you, nor the bacteria, because you're deposited really quickly under a lot of sediment and dirt. And it would be silty, muddy dirt that's perfect for fossilization. So does that match with a large flood? Well, yes, actually. And most scientists and evolutionists, regardless, will say that fossils are produced during floods, because that's, there's no getting around that.
And if you're still skeptical on how the fossils are produced by flood, something that's interesting you can look up is the called death pose, which is the position that fossils are found in for... I mean, I'm not going to do it. I probably look possessed. Really let's not demonstrate it right now. I was about to, so let's not do that. But they arch their back and their neck. Mm-hmm. And different types of dinosaurs do that. And from what I was reading as well, disturbingly, a university tried to recreate this with a emu. Poor emu.
With an emu? What a weird creature, okay?
Suppose it's similar, to some dinosaurs that they would have suggested. So anyway, and let's not get off topic. For what they found is that it's not from some illness that the animals had. That's why they.
It's a very strange. I mean,
yes, I know you all fossils.
They like open their neck up and bend it all the way back, and their mouth is wide open. It's very common. So common, in fact, that if you see like animations from secularists about dinosaurs and stuff like that, when they show the fossilization process, often they'll have the dinosaur like, crying out in pain, falling over, and they do this pose because that's how they find dinosaurs. But it's a really odd pose.
Yes, usually when animals die now, they just lie.
Yeah.
But for fossils, they are in very strange and contorted. And so the conclusion was, and it's from buoyancy, meaning from water, so from drowning, and then that leading to the death, and then they land on the sediment, and then clearly they deposit it quickly. But because of the drowning, they're arching their back. So it's not from some condition or illness, and it's also not from some spasm or anything like that. It's from a drowning and then burial, obviously, because the fossil needs to be preserved. So I thought that was fascinating.
Yep, but again, lining up with a flood, and that's why it's not really denied by scientists typically that most fossils are found in floodplains. But that's that meets right up with the flood narrative from creationists, so not much room there for the evolutionists to claim a win. Secondly, marine species, so those that live in water, are often found far away from places that they should be. For example, coral. You all know what coral is, grows around. So things that Finding Nemo runs around in, anemones in the coral reef. Mm-hmm. They need to grow in hard rocks to stay planted. That's how they stay. They can't sit on mud because it's too loose. They can't they don't have roots. They have to stick down on something hard. Coral has been found hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from any hard rock. It's all in this sediment, and that's how it's fossilized in the first place. Here in the United States and then across the world. And the question is, how did it get there? Because even if the ocean was there at some point, there's no hard rocks for it to have landed and started growing on. So it must have been knocked and carried away from its old place in the ocean to this place on land, which presumably would have been covered in water. And the only really way that could happen is for a sudden and temporary flood to happen. So it wouldn't have been old oceans that covered places and have now receded. It would have had to be a sudden flooding of the ocean and then leaving, and that left this coral where it shouldn't be.
What if some pterodactyl just brought it there from its trip to the beach?
Who knows? Maybe it's an engagement ring or something for a dinosaur. I'm not sure, but there's things like that, and not just coral. There's also lots of little like scallops and other marine species that have been found way up on mountains, like the Himalayas. Famously have fossils of things like that, like scallops and other clams and marine species up on the mountains, which evolutionists would say is just from millions and millions of years ago, where the mountains used to be the seafloor, and they've since risen up
and moved up.
But we would also posit that it would be very in line with the Genesis line that all the mountains were covered with water, that marine species would settle on these mountains, and they're all small. It's not like they find big fishes up in these mountains, and that's, to me, that tells me that these were like active settling of these little clams on the mountains as opposed to being washed up onto these mountains, which then I would then refer to the time period that we talked about for the flood, that it lasted 180 plus days, meaning that there was plenty of time, half a year, for species like clams and stuff to have settled on, the Himalayas before the waters receded again. So it lines up with the flood narrative, I think, perfectly again.
Poor clams. They were just getting acclimated and then no water anymore.
New home, and then,
and then they died, and they dry up and die. But anyway, on that same note about underwater plants, something I've found really interesting is that when you find pigment on plants, or obviously there were plants back then, many looked like they came out from Predator versus Alien, from the Jurassic world.
Mm-hmm.
So, but something I was reading is from, and it's not just one, there's several different plants and organisms that have been found with pigmentation. So, from in the Sahara, these are unicellular organisms, 1.1 billion years old, it says, and they had pink pigment found on them. Well, that is, I think, is fascinating. I think it's really wonderful to study something like this. The problem with this is that, if I recall correctly, DNA unravels, it breaks, it ceases to be those types of compounds like color after 10,000 years. So, and this is 1.1
billion years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Same also for flowers. As I was saying, they look like they're from Alien versus Predator versus Alien, and likewise, they have purple pigment on them. If they were millions of years old, there should be absolutely no pigment found on those, in those fossils. So, the fact that what we hold is not only the flood, but also a young Earth, would be more consistent with us finding color in fossils, because not only were they covered quickly, but also it wasn't that long, like millions of years old. It was just thousands of years.
Yeah, and let's put a pin in that, because I think there's really damning evidence these days. And again, I know that I'm not unaware that creationism has been clouded in like conspiracy theory style skepticism from most of the community, the scientific community, for years, not only because they hate God, but also they just think that it's pseudoscience. But these days, the amount of fossil evidence coming out like this, and I think that's the kind of stuff that really puts a nail in the coffin for the billions of years old model that everybody loves to hold to. Because it's not just, it's like many competing scientists that are all secularists, yes, but they don't necessarily agree with each other, all believe in a super old Earth, and the evidence just seems overwhelming that it's not an old Earth. Except that they've got dating models that tell them that it's old. I think they might have to point to their dating models and say, hey, we haven't even tested this on known dated things, which, by the way, they don't, because it always comes out wrong. In any case, let's put a pin in that, because there's other examples of that. I just want to go through the last couple of points on supporting the flood in particular.
Please.
One other point is that footprints are typically patterned. So footprints of not people, but actually sometimes of people, but we're talking specifically of animals. So lizards, dinosaurs, animals, etc. They are found before bones in rock layers, in the sediment layers, when you're doing a dinosaur dig. So at the very bottom layers of the place where there's anything to find in these sediments are the footprints, and the bones appear later, which would make sense if there was a flood happening rapidly, depositing these sediment rapidly, as opposed to slowly over time. If it was just a slow buildup of sediment that's showing you a long-term history where the oldest animals are dying in the very bottom layer and the newest animals are dying in the very top layer, you'd expect to see footprints throughout all of these layers, because creatures are walking around, it's millions of years of time, you're going to find footprints on all the layers. Mm-hmm. But if it was a rapid depositing of sediment from a flood, you'd expect to see footprints in the very bottom, because the creatures are walking around while the flood waters are coming and making footprints, and then eventually the water gets too high and they die. First the smallest animals, and then the biggest animals, the ones that couldn't survive in the water, died first. And so you'd find footprints on the very bottom layer, and then the smallest animals getting up to the biggest. And that is what we find in like the Wyoming big range in the United States, for example. That kind of footprint, then small animals, then big animals, layers. And what's interesting about the United States in particular, and I only say about the United States because other countries have dinosaur zones, like China, for instance, has a really big up-and-coming dinosaur dig scene, but it's all in Chinese, and it's kind of hard to figure out and study for me and other English-speaking paleontologists and stuff like that. So we just know North America pretty well. In North America, there's the Rocky Mountains, if you're aware, and the Rocky Mountains are high above the ocean floor, and so the vast majority, if not all, the dinosaurs found on the North American continent are on the Rocky Mountain Ridge. So either next to it in a big plateau, like where Wyoming and Montana and other places right there are, or on the other side in California. They're all on the high ground, and there are whole sections that aren't found with any young. It's only old, mature dinosaurs, not the little babies. And so the theory goes that if there was a flood, it would have been encroaching from the seas, so from the East Coast and the West Coast, and the water would have been rising and rising and rising and rising and rising, and eventually making it to the mountains. So animals that were escaping the flood would have been fleeing on foot towards the high ground where there wasn't water yet. And so they would be leaving footprints, and they would be leaving their young behind if the young couldn't keep up with them because the water keeps rising. And that's what we find in not only North America. There's patterns that say it's similar in other dinosaur finding regions in Africa and China, but then again, they're not very well studied because they're kind of new growing areas of paleontology. So I can't tell you definitively there, but in the North America, that is the pattern we find, and we would assume it'd be the same pattern everywhere, which is evidence for the flood, as opposed to other things that could have killed large swaths of dinosaurs. There's huge dinosaur graveyards of a bunch of animals that died together in that death pose with none of their young with them towards high ground. Just sounds like a flood to me. And again, it would have happened, the flood, over time, not just suddenly and instantaneously. So these animals would have had time to flee up to where they ended up dying.
There you go.
And I have one more. This is a kind of small one and probably not that interesting, but when you look at footprints from dinosaurs, there's very few tail drags. Tail drag meaning their tail, and most dinosaurs have a big old tail. They would be dragging behind them. So when you're walking, you'd have lines of the tail also dragging on the dirt. So you have footprints and then the tail drag. You see that with animals with tails today. They leave tail drags, pretty telltale sign of when people track animals and how they're moving. But for dinosaurs, there's very few instances of tail drags. And of course, that could be for a lot of reasons. Maybe they walked in a weird, they walked with their tails always up, but their spines aren't built like that typically. A theory from creationists positing is that these dinosaurs are walking, which is, it's hard to fossilize footprints, just like it's hard to fossilize anything. Walking in water that's running with sediment is really the only way to fossilize footprints. So in the scenario where they're walking, it has to be during the flood time when there's water on their feet rushing towards a certain place. Not only are there instances of animals walking at a weird angles, so they're like walking straight, but their feet at a weird angle because presumably a current was pushing against them. So they're trying to walk straight, but a sideways current is coming at them, and so they're having to kind of angle themselves to go forward. Not only do we see that, but we also see very few tail drags, presumably because their tail would have actually been riding and resting on top of the water, kind of floating on top of the water behind them, and therefore not hitting the ground and dragging behind them. So that's just interesting. That's probably the least strong of all the flood support there, but I just thought that was neat.
No, it's pretty interesting. That's something I hadn't really heard before, and it makes sense. If there's a lot of water, your tail's going to float.
Yeah, or at least be lifted up a little bit. You're not going to be dragging it across the ground so much. All right, so that's all the flood, just specific to the flood, reasons why real scientific evidence does not dispute the Bible. The Bible doesn't, you don't have to be afraid as a Bible-believing Christian that evidence out there is disputing you, despite what many scientists will say. They'll just say the words, the Bible is fake, science debunks the Bible, but they won't tell you what exactly debunks it, or if they tell you what debunks it, it's not true, or it doesn't actually debunk it. So this is just support for the flood narrative. Not only that, I also just want to talk about fossil evidence in general that goes against evolution and supports God's creation. You pointed out, Sebastian, that there's algae or bacteria in the Sahara Desert that has pigment in it that shouldn't be surviving. There's also pigment, more than pigment, blood vessels and skin cells found in dinosaurs. I think since the 80s, early 80s or late 80s and the early 90s, that had bone marrow and blood still in some of these dinosaurs. The T-Rex, even, the famous dinosaurs, have been found with bone marrow in them and blood still in that bone marrow, which is, it's cool because, here's a living, or dead, but a, preserved cell from a really old creature, but also it's presumably a too old to have anything remaining like that creature. So science itself says that this should be, 100 million times dead by now. So scientists have no answer, by the way, for why this stuff remains. There's some like wacko theories, but none of them are broadly accepted. And honestly, I think scientists were stunned. And in the late 80s, early 90s, when bones are being found like that, they're rare, but they're not unique. So it's not like one that was found this way. They come up every once in a while. Scientists hid them. This wasn't widely published because it's shocking. Like it should not be the case. It's kind of like finding a ruin of a skyscraper in ancient Babylon. Like you're doing paleontology and suddenly there's a skyscraper and you're like, how is there? That doesn't happen, of course. But if it did happen, you'd be like, this seems out of place. Like they shouldn't be able to make skyscrapers in ancient Babylon.
Never know what they had before the flood. They could have had, like that show that they. Oh my goodness, my memory cartoon. They lived in the future.
The Jetsons.
Yes, Jetsons.
Yes, well, maybe it's possible for humans in Babylon, but for animals, blood staying, it's not even physically possible. Right. So it defies the law of physics to say that animal is also 110 million years old. Of course, we would say it's not entirely surprising. It's still rare to find blood because blood should be gone in, a couple of years, let alone a couple thousand years. But in ideal conditions, we're saying it can last at least 10,000 years, say scientists. And we don't believe that Earth is 10,000 years old. So, of course, you're going to find things with skin still on them. Again, those examples kind of brushed under the rug. Again, conspiracy theory skeptics is what they would have labeled people who are bringing those kind of things up. However, the evidence has been mounting and mounting of that kind. So much so, and really I think the nail in the coffin for an evolutionary timescale, but nobody's acting like it is, I guess, is an entire dinosaur, preserved, mummified in Canada, was found. And it's a species that is, not only was that particular mummy dated to this, but it's also a species they date to 110 million years ago. It's one of those dinosaurs with the rocks on the end. I don't know what they're called. I would give you the name. I did research it, but it wasn't something I recognized. I figured I was going to give it to you. But it's kind of a recognizable looking iconic dinosaur. The whole thing. I'm not kidding you. If you don't believe me, look it up because it's not a weird creationism thing. The first time I saw it was actually in an ad on YouTube for Curiosity Stream, which is like an offshoot of the Science Channel, promoting evolution. So it was not a creationist gotcha moment that they've like produced a fake mummy or something. It's promoted by secular scientists. This is a real thing. They found it in Canada, 110 million years old supposedly, and it's fully preserved. Like you can see its face and its skin and everything. Like it's been mummified, like you find mummified remains in ice, like Iceman.
I don't know what you're talking about. It looks great. I'm looking at this for the first time.
It looks creepy, dude. His eyes are closed. I mean, it looks like a mummy, okay? But it is a dinosaur-looking thing, which is amazing. So not only amazing find, and of course that is rare. It is unique for creatures like that. But it should be impossible. It should be impossible, regardless of the preservation method. It's perfectly cryogenically preserved. It doesn't matter. It should not look like that today. If it's 110 million years old, it's impossible. And scientists, to my understanding, have zero answers that actually make sense. I think there's some that say that maybe in ideal conditions, like the iron in the blood, like stopped bacteria, or there's some weird clean room in the universe that this thing was put in. But in any case, it shouldn't be physically possible, and yet we have them, and which tells you that it isn't 110 million years old. And I think that really should be the home run, nail in the coffin. Your theory is junk. Look, we've proved at least this little dude was living less than 10,000 years ago.
Wow. No. If I could look like that in 10,000 years, it'd be great. I don't know what you're talking about. But
he's dead, Sebastian. I don't think you want to look like that.
But seriously, wow. And the guts, too. It's also been published in England and by National Geographic. It's amazing. And I'm actually seeing this for the first time. I'm just admiring. So, wow. I don't know if they nickname him Leo, but it's a nodosaur.
An autosaur?
Nodosaur. Okay. As if you were Spanish, nodosaur.
It's not one I had ever heard of. The only dinosaurs that I know are from Land Before Time, and so, it's not Littlefoot. That's that I've confirmed. It's not Ducky or any of those guys. It's not a T-Rex, so kind of at a loss.
Wow.
But not only this, I think that's just such a, it's so embarrassingly disproving of the evolutionary time frame. I think it's major.
Wait, before you don't get away from Leo, because it is believed the huge beast drowned when it was swept out to sea during heavy flooding.
Well, there you go. Proof that they're fine with saying it's a flood. They just don't put the two pieces together or refuse.
They don't capitalize the word flood.
Yes.
It's like lowercase.
Yeah. Just a regular giant flood. But that's not the only thing. So let me go through a couple other random points. Again, this is the evidence episode, so sorry if I'm boring you, but we're just going through the actual specific points of evidence because we didn't before. Now, fossils remain static across many layers, meaning they don't change. So if you're a T-Rex on the bottom layer, the T-Rexes you find on the top layer of when T-Rexes are found look the same. They haven't speciated. They don't have wings or that's exaggeration, but they're not another species. They stay like a T-Rex for long periods of time, and then they die out. There's a period where T-Rexes live, and there's a period where other things live. Periods in the layers, at least, which shouldn't be true or wouldn't likely be true if evolution was true, because species are constantly adapting, constantly evolving. You wouldn't expect a species to stay the same for a very, very long period of time. But the excuse that scientists give is that the dinosaur was just so perfect, just so well adapted that it didn't have to adapt at all, no changes whatsoever, in like 300 million years or however long they were living, for long periods of time. And that's just kind of sad because it's direct evidence against rapid speciation or even long-term speciation and genus bending and all the other type of things that they would posit come with evolution. And yet it rolls off their shoulder, right? They're like, well, I guess no evolution this time. But not only that, there's a core prediction from evolution that you expect to see if the evolutionary model is what was taking place. And that's called diversity before disparity. Meaning, diversity is when you have many small changes in a species. So like humans have diversity, right? Me and Sebastian look different. We are different, but we're both humans. We're not that different.
Twinsies.
Yeah, we're basically twins in the grand scheme of things. But we are different, right? But that would be diversity. And that's why we have diversity quotas and all that type of stuff. You're not having to hire dogs, you're hiring, other people. But for disparities means large changes between things. So like if it was Sebastian and a pterodactyl here, that there would be disparity in this podcast because one of us is a pterodactyl and can't speak, and Sebastian
is
a
speaking
and is speaking, and one of us is a human that's speaking. So that would be disparity. So in the evolutionary model, you should see diversity, so many species that are very similar, and then they would diverge and become disparate, meaning that eventually you'd end up with things that were very different from each other, but originally you had things that were really similar to each other. Again, like the tree model you said, where you've got a trunk of a tree and it slowly expands out to a bunch of different species. However, the fossil record shows, and then again, this isn't some conspiracy theory that creationists have created, and I'll tell you why in a second, but this fossil record shows that you actually have disparity and not a lot of diversity in the fossil record. In fact, in these large fossil deposits, they will find 20 different classes. So those are big categories, like Europe-sized categories of arthropods, so crabs. 20 different classes, so like not just a species, but huge groups, very diverse, different groups. 20 of them out of 25 found. So they found 25 fossils of arthropods. There'll be 20 of them that are from totally different classes. Today, we only have 6 classes of arthropods, which means that there was more diversity of dead things there than there exists of diversity in the entire Earth today, meaning that these old creatures that died in the fossil record were very different from one another. They were very distinct from one another. They weren't very similar to one another, at least, across different kinds of things. In their own species, of course, they're very similar. They're all the same species, but across different species, there's a lot of disparity. And there wasn't a lot of diversity. There wasn't a lot of similar looking arthropods. It was mostly different. They're mostly totally different, which doesn't line up with evolution's model, but it does line up with the Genesis model. And that's why I read it in the beginning. Genesis 1 says that God made each creature according to its kind. And so if they continued on and he made a great number of kinds, you'd see lots of different kinds distinct from each other, totally different, maybe similar, they're all arthropods, but they're all different classes of arthropods, you'd expect to see a lot of disparity. And as those kinds went on, they would diverge slightly, because we all agree that adaptation happens. So you'd have speciation within those genuses, or whatever we want to say a kind is, but they would all be disparate from the get-go, whereas evolution says the opposite. So we find in the fossil record disparity before diversity, whereas you'd expect the opposite if evolution was happening. And all that to say, again, it's not a crazy conspiracy theory that I'm just blabbing to you. Of course, I'm not a paleontologist. I'm getting this from secondary sources, and so you're getting this from a third-hand source at least. But I remember in science class, they pitched to us an idea that they immediately swept under the rug because they don't really agree with it, called punctuated equilibrium. That is the evolutionary secular idea that evolution happens in spurts, that you stay stable as a species for a very long time because you've adapted and it works. Kind of like the T-Rex. He's living for 300 million years. It's fine. Everything's going dandy, so he doesn't need to change. There's no evolutionary pressure to make him sprout wings or whatever else trait might help him survive. But in a small period of time, say a meteorite lands, there's suddenly tremendous evolutionary pressure to try to make creatures that eat, a certain type of plant that's now prolific or can eat rocks or something, whatever adaptation might help them live. It tremendously pressures that species so that it rapidly changes, because only like the weirdest of that species can live, and so a ton of them die off and only a very small portion of them live, and then they change drastically over a period of short years. And that's the theory of how things might change. The only reason that they have the model of punctuated equilibrium versus the other gradual change model is that the gradual change model doesn't fit the fossil record, and the punctuated equilibrium does. That's because we don't find transitionary species, which is a complaint from creationists since the dawn of time, that we don't have these transitionary species. Show me the missing link. Where's the ape that is between us and a gorilla? There's none. So not only with humans, but also with every animal under the sun, there's no missing links. And you might have heard of them in science class, but they're really not. Like, there's a famous one of the whale. Like, it was a dog at first, like this dog-looking thing. But what messed up person decided the dog was a missing link between a whale and, like, whatever its previous ancestor was? I mean, the thing looks like a dog. And then they're like, okay, the dog then turned into this dolphin thing. And you're like, what? Oh, because I kind of thought the dolphin thing was a dolphin thing, not a transition between the dog and the whale. So there really is not a gradual transition. And Charles Darwin originally said this. He said he expected to see many transitionary fossils, and he didn't. And he hoped that people over time would find them, and they just haven't. So it should go to show you that this isn't just a creationism complaint that scientists ignore. Scientists know the problem. That's why they posited punctuated equilibrium to say that, well, maybe evolution just happens super fast. We can never get transitional fossils. But I'm kind of convinced the reason that they don't promote that view today is because, first of all, it doesn't make sense evolutionarily, like mechanically, because really fast evolution is just impossible. If there was enough pressure that would require a species to grow a new trait super, super fast, it would just kill the creature. Like, if the only way that we could live the next 20 years to reproduce is if we sprouted gills because the whole world was flooding, well, we're all just going to die. We're not going to sprout gills. And so that's the kind of pressure that would just kill animals. It wouldn't actually cause them to change. That, I think, is a reason that it hasn't caught on as a popular model. I also think, this is maybe my cynical side, I also think we don't teach it in school. I heard about it in school, but it was the alternate throwaway theory they gave you, is because they don't want to examine why this theory exists in the first place. Why would we even have punctuated equilibrium in the first place? The only reason you have it is because we don't find transitionary fossils in the fossil record. And if you were going to explain that to a bunch of ninth graders, well, they might lose their faith in, Charles Darwin, blessed be upon him. So that's kind of my cynical theory on why they don't teach punctuated equilibrium. Not only does it not make much sense, but it also would cause skepticism in the class, and we can't have that in science class, no. I've only got one other point, Sebastian, but I've been talking for a while. Do you have anything else to say about the fossil record?
I'm just imagining. The world back then must have been pretty wild. So much diversity.
A lot of despair, yeah. It's cool.
A lot of diversity and a bunch of giant animals roaming around.
We should say, to get our last dig in from the Bible here, there was an early sect when dinosaurs were first coming out. There's a lot of Christians very early on that were like, oh, maybe dinosaurs aren't real. This is all fake because we don't believe in an old Earth, blah, blah, blah. But you don't have to believe in an old Earth to believe in dinosaurs because, well, this isn't the only reason, but let me tell you, the Bible mentions what we would presume are dinosaurs. Maybe to a person who doesn't know about dinosaurs, you might not think so, but to we who know about dinosaurs, I would say these fit perfectly. In Job, to throw back, God describes huge creatures. I don't know if you have it pulled up.
And that's my cue.
That's your cue.
Wow.
Wink, wink.
Job 40. Look at Behemoth, which I have made along with you, and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscle of its belly. Its tail sways like a cedar, the sinews of its thighs are close knit. Its bones are tubes of bronze, its limbs like rods of iron. It ranks first among the works of God, yet its maker can approach it with his sword. The hills bring it their produce, and all the wild animals play nearby. Under the lotus plant lies, hidden among the reeds of the marsh, the lotus is concealed. Okay, and then it goes on. Ranging with the creation.
Well, you find the other one. So that's the first reference.
Yeah.
There's actually two in Job. So that's behemoth. You've heard the word behemoth before. We use it for big things. But the traditional explanation, again, pre-dinosaurs discovery, was that must be a hippo or something. But a hippo's tail, I don't know if you've ever seen a hippo's tail. And we've said this before, I think, in the Creationism, because it's so ridiculous. Hippo's tail is like a little wimpy little thing, like an Eeyore, pin the tail on a donkey thing. Whereas the tail described here is like a cedar tree. I'm thinking that's a huge, I don't know if you know your dinosaurs, but the big apatosaurus, the huge long necks, as if you know your Land Before Time terminology, the long necks, the ones that eat grass, they're huge, the biggest dinosaurs on land, and they are thought to have lied in rivers, walked around in rivers because they're so tall that they could have their feet on the bottom of the river and their head sticking out the top, which does a couple things. First of all, it keeps them cool because they're so huge that they'd be really hot in the sun. And then two, it allows them to relieve some of the weight on their body because they're so heavy that they would probably hurt to walk around because they're so huge. But if they're in water, just like if you're in water, you feel lighter because the water is floating you. They do a lot of good. So that would describe it lies among the reeds. Sounds like an apatosaurus. So I don't know how that makes a hippo, but it certainly sounds like an apatosaurus. Christians don't have to be afraid of dinosaurs existing. Even if it wasn't referenced in the Bible, there's nothing against dinosaurs in the Bible. And I would say this is a clear reference to it.
And it's also mentioned in the Book of Enoch, but never mind that. Never mind that.
So we don't want to talk about the Book of Enoch. Come on.
Yeah. But that is interesting. So just the bones being like tubes of bronze and the tail being gigantic, it's only the Palosaurus or Brachiosaurus, ones with the really long necks and the really long tails. So it's just fascinating.
Yeah, and there's another reference in Job 2 to the Leviathan, which is like a water version, which again, the traditional explanation is that it's an alligator, but it's also kind of hilariously compared because people approach, it's also like who can put a hook in Leviathan's nose. What do you mean? The alligator hunter? Like, pretty sure the crocodile hunter like wrestles alligators, right? And we know the ancient Egyptians also like fought alligators, so I don't think that the alligator's fearsome, but it's not that fearsome. But the way Job, or God, actually describes the Leviathan in Job is like untamable, and we know the sea creature that we would say it is the extinct plesiosaur, I think is what it is. It is kind of like a apatosaurus, a big long neck, but it has flippers instead of feet, and it flies around on the oceans and eats things and has big fangs. Now that's an intimidating sight. I don't know, the crocodile,
Yes. For reference, it's what some people that try to chase the Loch Ness monster, that's what they say it is.
Yeah, exactly.
That's another can of worms. Let's not die.
Yes. Yep. So all that to say, I'm going to skip some of my points because this has already been such a long episode, but we've said a lot here. We've gone through a lot of specific points, and the general gist that we want you to get is, like we said at the beginning of the episode, there's plenty of this. There's plenty of science, real science behind the Christian worldview. And it's not that we based our beliefs off of the science, because we actually base the beliefs off of Scripture. And that's why I feel for Christians who believe the scripture and are afraid of science because it's contradicting scripture. We shouldn't be afraid of real science. Scientists might themselves contradict scripture because they hate God and many other reasons, but I would posit that they either have the wrong evidence, they've got evidence that's not true. For example, they'll use dating methods that say things are millions of years old, and I don't believe those dating methods work reliably, so there's an instance of bad science. But they also might take good evidence, like these fossils being preserved and being part of floods and other things like that, and they have the fossils in hand. They might take good evidence and come up with bad explanations, like, shrug shoulders, I guess it was like preserved by iron deposits and that's why the skin is still there, or this was just a local flood that kept it there, or the coral must have grown here back when this is an ocean even though there's no rocks. They might come up with an explanation that quote unquote fits the evidence but doesn't really, when our theory, our fact from the Bible fits it better. So all that to say, Christians should not be afraid of real evidence. In fact, because we know that God's word is truth and he's the creator of the world, we should be all the more confident than the evolutionists, to go out and actually dig in the earth and to see and to discover what the world really has to say about what has happened, because we will be vindicated and they will be unvindicated.
Right. And I would say, the courage part, it takes practice. So it is something to dedicate yourself to. So it's not just going to come overnight. For example, we're mentioning, how could you get the courage to discuss these things? There's no shame in that. You will all learn from our mistakes. Something that tripped me up when I was a very, very young Christian, not young person, but I mean immature and new to the faith, was when some Jain, like from the religion Jainism, asked me, "Do you eat shrimp?" And said, "Yeah, but that's in the Bible, right? So you're not a Christian because you eat shrimp." And that, for whatever reason, really tripped me up. And then later understood, that question doesn't even make sense. What?
Well, we understand what they're saying. They're saying it's not a clean food from Leviticus, right? But we would say that God has made all foods clean.
Yes.
As it says in the Bible, the same Bible, right?
Yeah, so my point from that is that I didn't quite have a response to that at the moment. I hadn't really thought through. It takes practice with dedication, and with time, you actually do find, that is a silly question, because God answers that later on. So it's not as if you're left on a cliffhanger, not knowing, should I eat shrimp or not should I eat shrimp? There's actually, that was for a purpose. My point is, I was able to understand that purpose, and then later found out its fulfillment in the New Testament for the food and that are clean or unclean. And then Jesus fulfilled the law, so we don't need the ceremonial, the law. Likewise, for these things, I would say it takes exposure and practice. Should we prove the Bible from the evidence? I would say that there's no need to go from that direction backwards. You can actually you can enhance your biblical reading from what you can observe in nature.
Yes, and so for like an apologetics mindset, like you're saying, if you run into an evolutionary person, a person that believes the evolutionary mythology, I'll say, which is very, very common, it's the age that we live in, I don't think this is the first thing that you need to bring up, because frankly, you can get into a quagmire, and if you're not a paleontologist and they're not a paleontologist or are familiar with, I don't, as interesting as I think these things are, I don't want to get into a Genesis debate with an evolutionist, only because there are more important things to talk about. And like you just said, Sebastian, the word actually cuts, regardless of if the person believes it or not. It is the sword of God. And so if you use scripture to quote, to cut them with conviction of sin, telling that asking them to sin, using it as a reflection, using the law of God as a reflection of their own actions, that they see that they've sinned, even if they say they don't believe it, it will cut them. And that's what you use to actually share the gospel. So I would sideline the Genesis topic for fellow Christians, really. Unless you're being specifically attacked about Genesis, you might use something that we talked about in this conversation, or something else to quickly answer what the secularist has to say, but I would immediately divert into the actual gospel, something profitable and ready to save their souls, as opposed to just some question of science, because you can spend all day talking about Genesis and not convince anyone.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile to keep in a tool belt, but this is not the hammer.
Yeah.
This is not the measuring stick that you use. So this is secondary. It's nice, it's interesting, but it's not the main. It's not primary.
Yes. Now, again, the part of the reason I'm so interested in it is because it is so popular for Christians to believe in the old Earth evolution theory, even though it's plainly, and we talked about this in our previous Creationist episode, it's plainly this not congruent with the Genesis view. And to believe in an evolutionary time frame, time scale mythology is to refute the biblical time frame mythology, the origins of the Bible or the world as outlined in the Bible. So you either choose in that point God or the world, and so many Christians are choosing the world in that. And I'm saddened for my brothers and sisters in Christ for doing that. So I really want to get the word out that, hey, you don't even need to do that. I'm convinced the only reason they're doing that, on believing Christians that is, the only reason they're selling out Genesis for the world's narrative is that they think it's, they think Genesis is wrong and it doesn't line up with what the evidence of the world says. And I say, no, you first of all, don't give up like that. And second of all, the world actually does prove Genesis right. You don't have to be afraid like that.
Likewise, so same with the shrimp. Someone keeps telling you, oh, Genesis is metaphorical. It's all, the creation is just, some Moses got high and then started writing that, whatever it may be. Trying to be a little bit humorous on that. No offense to Moses. But what did we find? Okay, call myself a Christian, myself speaking as if anybody, and then I find Jesus citing the flood, that myth that some random Jew made up 3,000 years ago, and then Peter, the right man of Jesus, who denied him and is also, one of the main apostles, also referencing back to the flood. Like, there's something probably going on around here, so... Yeah, so rather than just taking a word for it, I would reevaluate yourself. So if you have gone into believing the old world or the anti, the no flood narrative, there's no such thing as the flood or the creation, however it happened, then you're not being consistent, I would say, because you're being selective. You're choosing some Christian beliefs, you're ignoring others. But then likewise, you're being selective with evolutionary beliefs. For example, you're adding in that God created the universe, which from most of the evolutionary people would say that the universe came from...
You're not really winning many friends, huh?
Yes. Yep. So by trying to merge both, you've actually alienated yourself from everybody. And you're not being consistent in either one. I would say... Sure, I'll say pick one. Stick to it and be consistent.
Hot or cold, right? Yeah.
Pick one side and be consistent with it. And I would say always continue doing research on that. Obviously, we hold that Yahweh has revealed his purpose, why he created this universe, and what his intentions are. And he has left all these wonderful things for us to observe. And that's how we interpret these things. But we're trying to our best to be consistent with that. Likewise, don't be selective with, okay, I'm a Christian, but I also believe in old Earth, or, but I don't want to believe in that the universe came from nothing because I believe that God made it. So be consistent.
Well, and I know we've run really long in this episode, but we currently live in a non-Christian society. I mean, I understand the polls might say we're Christian or whatever, but the schools and the culture at large are secular, right? Imagine we all know that pre-Christianity becoming big in Europe and across the world, it was the minority, so it's not new to the Christian experience to be in the minority. If we were in Scandinavia when the Vikings were there and we were Christians amongst a world of pagans, they would have plenty of quote-unquote evidences for their gods. They would say, and we know that their gods are all mythology, right? Freya and Thor, they're not real, but they would say, oh, look, Thor is the god of lightning and storms. When he tosses, I don't know Norse mythology very well. When he tosses his hammer, lightning bolts fly across the sky, and look, a lightning bolt has flown across the sky. Thor is real. You wouldn't be like, oh no, like oh gosh, I guess there must be right. And when God says in the Bible that he launches lightning, he must be wrong because they just told me it was Thor. Like you would never panic like that, and you would never cede to them. Okay, well, yes, Thor throws the lightning, but God made Thor. You wouldn't say that. And today, Christians that are doing that for our mythology, I know seculars have dressed it up, and I guess it sounds better than Thor throwing lightning because they've got fancier words and much longer videos and British accents and whatever. But it is still mythology. It's still against the Bible. And equally, we shouldn't be surrendering to it and saying, oh, well, I guess God made evolution? What trash? Anyways, I don't have a lot of patience for it in that regard. I have patience with my brothers and sisters who are caught up in it. I understand why you would be. I'm just exhorting you not to be.
Well, to be fair, God did make Chris Hemsworth. So he
That's
did
true.
create Thor.
I don't think when Chris Hemsworth, I don't think he can make lightning, unfortunately for him.
Right.
And that is why we have found our cause in the true and living God, Lord Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening. I've been Michael, the man behind the machine, and to my right has been
Sebastian, the bookkeeper.
If you want to see the rest of our episodes, you can go to foundcause.podbean.com and download them all at your listening pleasure. And if you want to see our actual videos, not just our audio, you can go to facebook.com/foundcause or go to YouTube and look us up there. You can also search iTunes or ask your Amazon Echo. We're even there. It's amazing. Leave a review or like our videos or whatever if you want to help us out. And you can even send us an email or a Facebook message or whatever if you have any suggested topics. Maybe one of these days we'll get our third man in, Theodore, once again. We've been pondering around to see if we can get in. I don't know where he'd fit in this current setup. Like, would he sit right here like a little toddler or maybe on the ground? I don't know. We'll figure it out. But until next time we talk about something totally different. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.